Welcome to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. I'm Matthew of castingacross.com, where I explore the quarry and culture of fly fishing. Today we're talking about fly fishing in the winter. Now, when it's getting cold out, a lot of people take the opportunity to put their gear away for a couple of months and take it easy, whether that be through simply fly tying or pursuing other hobbies like deer hunting or watching TV or hibernating. Those things are totally okay. In fact, you can be an avid fly fisher and take months and months off. There's nothing wrong with that. You don't lose your street cred, or at least you shouldn't. But if you want to get out, that's a completely other thing. There's nothing saying that you can't fly fish in December, January, February, depending on where you live in the country, what those winter months are. And as long as local regulations allow it, then you can ethically pursue fish. That is to say that by catching these fish, you're not pulling them out of the one spot that they need to be in to survive, or that air temperatures are so cold that as they get removed from the water, they're really going to get adversely affected. It's totally fine to fish, and you're not limited to standing over a hole in the ice pulling fish out that way, which is a lot of fun, but it simply isn't fly fishing. So there's a few things that I want to mention regarding winter fly fishing. There's a lot of different topics that could be covered. We could talk about gear. We could talk about just the biological necessity that fish have to eat, and so they will be feeding during the wintertime. We could talk about effective patterns, effective tactics, and those are things that I've explored on Casting Across and things that we'll probably talk about on the podcast in the future. But for the sake of today, I want to focus on kind of big umbrella broad level stuff, and that is 3 spots and then 1 mindset you need to be in when you're fly fishing in the winter. So when I talk about spots, I'm not talking about a specific place. I'm not saying go to Creek X in state Y. That's where you'll catch fish in the winter. There are some tried and true spots, but I think all of them fall into the categories of these 3 types of water I'll be mentioning. And the first is spring creeks. Now, if you live close to a healthy spring creek, you're in luck. That is just a treasure, something that unfortunately I kind of took for granted when I lived on the shores of a wonderful spring creek. I didn't know how good I had it. But regardless of winter weather, in fact, regardless of any weather, you're going to have steady flows, consistent water temperatures, and also prolific insect life. The awesome ecosystem of a spring creek makes it the perfect place for trout. They grow in abundance, and they grow big as long as the stream is in good shape, not polluted, not being poached, etc. And so trout, along with other species, thrive in spring creeks. And so that's easy. You know, there's spring creeks in Pennsylvania. There's spring creeks out in Montana. There's spring creeks all over the country that are just these beautiful, slow, meandering meadow streams with tons of aquatic vegetation and crazy currents, but lots of big fish. But that isn't the only kind of spring creeks that are out there. There's a lot of spring-influenced creeks that we don't even know about. And I think it's important that we do draw the distinction when we're talking about different water types and different environments, that we do make that distinction between spring creeks and spring-influenced or spring-fed creeks, or even creeks that just have spring seeps. But there are lots of rivers out there. There's also lakes out there that, just because of the geology and the hydrology of the area, the water table is higher, and so you have these cold infusions of water trickling in at different places. You may encounter this. I know a particular stream in Pennsylvania I used to fish a lot, and even in the summer months, fishing for smallmouth bass, you'd be wet wading and you'd feel this cold water just kind of originating from the stream bank at a certain spot. And that's an example of, actually a pretty stark example of what a spring seep is like. So in the summertime, that has its benefits, but in the wintertime, that also has its benefits, because if it is a large enough seep or a large enough influence, which could come again from the stream bank, or it could come from the edge of the stream, then you're going to potentially have open water. So whereas everything else is iced up, if the water coming in is warmer because it's coming from underground, then you might have open water. It might be for a few feet, which would make fly fishing a little complicated, but as long as the temperatures are a little bit more temperate, a little bit more mild, then those seeps and those spring influences will give you fishing for a prolonged stretch. And even if the water is open, then that's a stretch where the fish won't necessarily stack up in. And again, that goes back to the ethical fishing. You don't necessarily want to be fishing over fish that are stacked up, and this is the only place they can survive. And by pulling them out of an already stressful situation, you're causing problems for them. But this is a spot just to consider as you're fishing. Again, the same thing goes for lakes. There's places where the water is unusually warm, and that is because there is a influence from an underground water source. So these are stretches and spots that are going to hold fish and stay ice-free longer in a very natural setting, in a very natural way. And I've encountered this in the Carolinas, in New England, in the Midwest, and the Rockies, where you encounter these situations. So it's everywhere. So moving from spring creeks, the next spot for winter fly fishing that you could think about is tailwaters. They're not as natural as spring creeks, particularly if you're standing at the foot of a multi-100-foot dam. The last thing you think is, I'm in a natural setting. But as soon as you move downstream a bit, get a few bends away from the dam, which also usually moves you away from the crowds, it is an awesome environment and a wonderful place for fly fishing, especially fly fishing in those off months. Now, you could be spoiled. You might have a tailwater like they have down in the south part of the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA system that gets managed by the Army Corps of Engineers. And these are the rivers in Arkansas, the rivers in Missouri, the rivers in Georgia, the rivers in Tennessee that have just spectacular trout fisheries beneath them. Some of the biggest trout that get caught in the contiguous United States come from these places because they produce such healthy and such large fish. Food sources, consistent temperatures, consistent flows all go into making that happen, especially because it's also on a very large, wide, long river, dozens and dozens of miles often of river for these fish to live in. But again, that's not your only option when it comes to tailwaters. If it's a bottom release dam, so if the water comes through, usually this is for the hydroelectric purposes, if the water gets pulled from the bottom, then that water in the wintertime is going to usually be warmer than the water on the top of the lake or whatever is being impounded behind the dam. Again, this is a general principle, but it usually holds true. And so between the warmer water being pulled out from the bottom in the wintertime, then it is up on the surface, or if it's spilling over, you have either a temperature difference or you have just water moving quicker, and so it isn't going to freeze up as readily. It'll take some pretty cold conditions for waterfalls or spillways to freeze over. I've seen it happen, but it's just not that common. So you may have 100 feet, you may have 100 yards, you may have longer below a dam that's ice-free, and again, that fish are going to move up towards, especially predatory fish, and whether that be larger kind of typical warm water species like bass or like pike or muskie or just larger trout, they also key in on these spots because you get a large amount of bait fish coming through at different times of the year, and even including the winter time. And so anything that goes over a dam or through a hydroelectric turbine is not going to be particularly fleet of fin, and so they are easy pickings. And so a lot of times you do find large fish being plucked from right beneath dams. Once again, there's an ethical question there, depending on the water body you're fishing, how you're fishing, what time you're fishing, temperature, etc. Is that the right thing to do? And again, it's hard to make a judgment call without knowing the particulars, but that's just something to think about. Is there a tailwater around you? Doesn't have to be an enormous dam, but is there a 20-foot dam? Is there even a spillway that, because the water is moving quicker at that point, you'll be able to make a cast and have a good drift, fish a streamer, fish a nymph, even fish midges. All three of those angling techniques are completely viable in the wintertime in a spot like a spillway, even if it's just a really small, low head, low clearance dam. So we have spring creeks, we have tailwaters, and thirdly, we have warm water discharges. So if spring creeks are idyllic and tailwaters are compromised with a giant concrete structure, but then grandiose and amazing once you get beyond that, warm water discharges are, well, they're there and you can fish them. I've fished under and below power plants. I've fished under and below wastewater treatment facilities. and there are smells and there are sights that you really don't get anywhere else fishing in this wide world of ours. But regardless of the circumstances and the industrial feel, I've caught fish, and you can catch a lot of fish. So again, this might be totally offensive to you. The unnatural elements of fishing outside of a power plant or outside of a sewer plant, that might completely turn you off. And some of them, I would absolutely say you probably want to stay away from. Even with as strict of policies that we have in place, they're not perfect, and some people aren't always abiding by them perfectly. And so you could potentially be in a pretty foul situation. But there's some that are regulated well, both in the private and public sectors. And by fishing underneath these, what you're getting is a artificially induced warm water influence in the river. I've seen this in small rivers, and I've seen this in large rivers, and the fish will just thrive there in the winter months because they are following the bait fish, which are following the micro food sources that they feed off of. And so, again, this isn't the kind of place that usually you think of when you think of fly fishing. At the same time, this is the kind of place that a lot of traditional fishers, a lot of people who are using bait and plugs and spoons and jigs, they go there, and they usually have a pretty good following in places like this because they know that's where fish are. And that can be trout or catfish. That can be muskie, or that could be carp. Every fish, wintertime is the great equalizer where fish become incredibly opportunistic. And so if you find a spot like this, and you can legally, and you can either clip your nose or not deal with that. And so we can move to places like that when it is the best opportunity that we have available to us. The last thing that I want to mention is just our mindset. When it's cold outside, when it is uncomfortable to be outside, it's uncomfortable to fish. We can just be plain and clear about that. There is, again, no rule stating that we have to be tough, we have to gut it out, we have to lose the tips of fingers and have chapped cheeks to be considered fly fishers. It gets downright uncomfortable. However, this is 2018. The clothing we have at our disposal and the other gear that we can tap into, whether it be hand heaters or whether it be a hot beverage, it can keep you on the water a little bit longer. But we just have to get our minds right. We have to get our thinking straight about what this means. So the fishing is going to need to change. And you're going to fish lower, where the fish have a little bit more thermal protection. You're going to have fish slower, and you're going to have more patience. Again, if the fish are there, the fish need to eat. And as long as the environmental factors aren't pushing them outside of a healthy range, they're going to feed. And they probably are going to feed opportunistically. But they're not going to have the metabolic resources to chase after streamers ripped across the top of the water. They're not necessarily going to want to rise to a size 14 royal wolf. You're going to need to change your tactics. And again, that means lower and slower. You can still fish streamers. You can still fish multiple nymph rigs. You can still fish dry flies, but usually not blindly. Usually when fish are already sipping midges or sipping flies that are coming off, because there are plenty of flies that do come off during the wintertime. So it's really getting your mind around this is going to be different. And I would say that's probably your first thing. Before you start researching, is there a spring creek? Is there a tailwater? Is there a warm water discharge around me? Make sure you get your mind right. Make sure you understand what you're getting yourself into. I don't want to make it sound dire or like it's some grand quest, but I know a lot of folks who get amped up about going fishing in January only to come back and say, well, that was miserable because I was cold the whole time. Well, did you fish? No, I was too cold to fish. Well, it's January. If you live probably anywhere around or north of the Mason-Dixon line in the United States, it's going to be cold in January. but there's people that fish through these months, people who are crazy and fish multiple days a week for hours and hours and hours on end, and people that just get their courage up to go out for one trip a week or one trip a month. It's not out of the question, especially if you have these opportunities in places like spring creeks, tailwaters, and discharges where you have a better chance of catching fish. Because there's nothing that's going to warm you up more than having fish come to your hand and being able to appreciate what you enjoy doing, fly fishing, even in the difficult months. For this week's recommendation, I want to recommend the TU Trout Unlimited Fly Fishing and Conservation Camps. These camps are a wonderful opportunity for young people. It was started back in 1995 in Pennsylvania. The Cumberland Valley chapter of Trout Unlimited put on the very first fly fishing conservation youth camp. And the idea was that there are camps for everything else out there. And these camps are for kids that are interested in sports, and camps for kids who want to pursue these sports potentially long term, whether that be in college or even professionally. That's a big business. Well, we had a couple of men, specifically Dr. John Jack Beck and Enoch Moore, who put this camp on, and it's been going strong now for really 3 decades. There are camps all over the country: Arkansas, North Carolina, California, Oregon, Colorado, a couple in Pennsylvania, Georgia, Tennessee, Idaho, Texas, Illinois, Maine, 2 in Utah, Michigan, Vermont, Montana, the tri-state one, which is Virginia, Washington, Maryland, West Virginia, which used to be tri-state, and now I guess it's 3 states and a district. New Hampshire, Washington, Wisconsin, New York, and then there's actually a nationwide summit that they put on every year for kids that kind of get cold from all of these camps. This will be something I talk about on the podcast again in the future, because this is something that's near and dear to me, being both a participant as a student and as a volunteer for a number of years. But now is a great time, if you're listening to this in the wintertime, it's a great time to see what you can do for your local Trout Unlimited chapter, whether it be tie up a dozen flies, or donate something that you might have, or volunteer yourself. Or if you are a teenager, or you are the parent, grandparent, neighbor, friend of a teenager who's into fly fishing, push them towards this. It's a wonderful opportunity, a wonderful experience, something that will not only help them, but help their local chapters, their local waterways, and just conservation and the fly fishing culture moving forward. Thanks for listening to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. Please subscribe in your favorite podcast app and rate the podcast in iTunes. Then head over to castingacross.com, where you'll find more info on this podcast and 3 posts a week on the people, places, and things that go into the pursuit of fish.